first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for making this happen. The times are not easy. Most of us have to work under very difficult circumstances, so it's been a really long way from the point where Larissa and I met here in Berlin and then continued the conversation and decided that we should, well, do something about our shared interest in the history of African historiography. And so I'm really pleased to find us here and with all of you and all these great contributions. So I'll give you a brief run through and then hand over to Sol, who you can also see, who is a student assistant helping us with this, and we're very grateful for that. So in the first session, we will just have very brief presentations, again, of each paper that everybody will have read everybody's paper at this point, but we wanted to give everybody, again, the opportunity for 5 to 10 minutes to just give a summary or maybe highlight some aspects that you find most relevant for the following discussion. And then for the second session, which will start a little bit later, right, Larissa? We pushed back the schedule a little bit. So we will start the second session at 5:30. And Adam Getachew from Chicago will join us and give us a comment. She has read and studied all your papers. She just doesn't have time. She's in another meeting right now, unfortunately, to join us for this first session. So just as a technical point, I would like to ask everyone to mute their microphones unless they're called. Sol will introduce each speaker, and then as you're introduced, you can unmute yourself and give your talk, and then so Sol will guide us through the session. And all questions and discussions, please save it for the second session of this panel, where we will get a chance to do questions and comments. So Sol, you have the word now.
Hello, good afternoon. So our first panelist of today will be Kalpana Hiralal of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So you have 10 minutes approximately.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kalpana Hiralal from the Department of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. It's wonderful to be on the panel and to participate in this panel, particularly when there are such interesting papers that are going to be presented today. I will give a very kind of brief overview of my paper and what, one of the issues that I'm looking at, and it's part of my wider research, is to look at the role of women in the anti-apartheid struggle. Particularly in South Africa, because one of the challenges that I experienced in a try to engage in this particular study was the lack of archival information, particularly, and also narratives of women who, for example, who participated. Now, the challenge lies in the fact that, when we're talking about and trying to document the histories of women in South Africa, we tend to hear the voices of the more prominent women, the known women, who participated, or, but we very often do not hear of the voices and the narratives or the stories of the women, for example, who were behind the scenes, who assisted in other ways or other avenues. And so what I'm trying to do is also in this particular paper is to problematize the notion of resistance, the notion of resistance in nationalist struggle. And how do we deconstruct that particular understanding of resistance? Because resistance is not merely something that is seen only, for example, in someone being at the forefront of the struggle or, holding a placard or things like that. But I think we need to kind of deconstruct and probe a little bit further, because what resistance means. And also when we're trying to understand these nationalist narratives about women in the struggle, the nature of their activism, I mean, should we not then broaden this notion of resistance and activism beyond the individual, in the sense that it is not only the individual, but the wider families as well? So we're looking at, for example, not only the activist, but also the activist family. I mean, look at the male political activists. What about the roles of the wives, the mothers, the daughters, the sons, etc.? It all became a kind of a collective effort. So in other words, basically, what I'm trying to also understand and probe is say, there are more narratives to be unearthed, because also the wives played a pivotal role. So when the husbands were away at Robben Island or were being imprisoned, etc., who took charge of the homes? Who took charge of their livelihoods, etc.? So this is a kind of another narrative that I also want to kind of include. So I know we have limited time. So what I've tried to do is that in this particular paper, where I look at the lives of 3 particular women, and I look at the lives of Lillian Ngoyi, Sam Moodley, and Dr. Gunham. And what I try to do here is to look at their particular lives. They were activists in different kind of historical periods, and trying to look at over a period of, say, over 100 years, at the turn of the century till 1994. And so one of the things I try to do is to look also at the oral histories that were available, and they do provide some very interesting insights. And I try to provide very kind of short biographical profiles of these individuals. So some of the key questions that I'm trying to ask in this particular paper, besides deconstructing the notion of resistance, is not only, for example, documenting the narratives of women's political involvement from a woman's perspective, but also through this kind of biographical approach. And once again, I'm also problematizing the notion of the methodology that we use. It also allows us to see the kind of true diversity and the importance of women's contribution to the nationalist struggle. And here I've raised several key questions in that, particularly in relation to the subjects that I've focused on. So why did women, African or women of Indian origin, engage in political resistance? What did it mean to them? How did growing up in a predominantly Indian African area affect their political activities? And how did they reconcile the notion of being Indian and African identities within a broader South African identity? And what did it mean to be a South African as opposed to, in the context of, say, Dr. Gunham and Sam Moodley, Indian? And how did they challenge and negotiate their political activism in the context of entrenched gender norms? Did women's rights or feminism matter within the struggle? And why I've raised this particular question, because I think it's important that we do not homogenize women's political experiences, particularly their political activism, because what it was like to be an Indian and an African or a colored woman in the anti-apartheid struggle was different, because the laws affected them differently. Although they all were oppressed, you would find that the laws tended to affect them differently. So particularly in the context of the apartheid, the Group Areas Act, the past laws, etc. So the nature of their oppression tended to differ. And so this is important that these kind of nuances, for example, are unearthed as well. And also, what did it also mean, for example, for Sam Moodley or Dr. Gunham? On the one hand, they were, many of them were indentured stock of women of Indian origin. What did it mean? How did they kind of transgress, or how did they kind of challenge that kind of identity and see themselves as South Africans? Because many of these women, simply cast aside the Indian tag and saw themselves as South Africans. So how did they move from, that kind of that broader identity? To me, is extremely important to kind of unearth. And then very kind of quickly, some of the themes that I tried to explore in this particular paper, and I must add, it's very draft. It's a draft paper, so I'm still trying to engage in this particular aspect. Is also issues regarding, for example, the political agency of women at different levels, the vulnerabilities of women as political in their political activism. What were their lives like when they were imprisoned? How did they negotiate themselves? Also, the issues regarding gender issues within the nationalist struggle. What was the contestations between gender issues and nationalist issues? And then the other important theme that arises is the issue of identity, something that I alluded to earlier. And then last but not least is this, I think I'm also trying to understand the interracial and the intraracial sisterhood at different historical periods. Colonial and apartheid history created very kind of differential oppressions, differential resistance, and imposed material differences among the racial groupings. So while the law that applied to the Africans, Coloreds, and Indians were often different, their aim really was the same, to preserve and maintain the privilege of the white minority. And the effect of the law was the same. So you had violence, you had poverty, and humiliation and racism. So interracial solidarity can be discerned at different aspects of the resistance struggle. So, but what is important to see is that at the turn of the century and the first half of the century, I would say that politics was very racialized. But as the 1950s, as we approach the 1950s, from that onwards, there's a move towards, multiracialism, where there was a move towards the desire to form multiracial organizations that would, for example, where you had the Federation of South African Women, where there was a strong desire and a move towards non-racialism, where these political organizations, these women's organizations, in fact, FEDSA was the first multiracial, actually non-racial women's political organization established in 1954, where you had women from all the different race groups coming together. And that particular organization was successful in launching the 1956 and the past laws marches of the 1950s. So here we see women coming together, and this move towards non-racialism is something very, very interesting, and something that we see happening particularly after the 1950s. So I'll stop this, and if there are any questions, you can share me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The second panelist will be Casper Andersen of the University of Aarhus.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel, and also thank you very much for. It was really fascinating to read all the papers that have been sent. So my paper concerns UNESCO's archive of African oral traditions and UNESCO's role in that respect. It is part of an ongoing research interest that I've been working on the history of UNESCO and African decolonization for quite some time, but mainly focusing on the natural sciences. So I'm looking now at some of the knowledge practices, if you will, that are in the social sciences and the humanities. So UNESCO's involvement with African oral traditions really began in the 1960s, and there were several reasons for that. One of them was that oral traditions were considered an important part of the source base for UNESCO's general history of Africa that I think also Larissa will talk about. There was also a strong sense that the oral traditions were very important as a repository for African cultural past, and as such also really central for African nation building during this time. And this was very much an agenda that influenced UNESCO once we get into the 1960s, and that was influential among the African members and the African states within UNESCO. And finally, also the the making an archive of African oral tradition was also considered important, not just for historians, but also for linguistics and for anthropology and even also ecology. So for several disciplines had an interest in that as well. And then just want to add just one thing by way of context is also by the 1970s, another important dimension comes in as UNESCO became responsible for the cultural rights elements of the human rights initiatives relating to cultural rights. And here oral tradition, the right to culture, the right to oral tradition was also considered essential, which meant that UNESCO became involved also in the dissemination of African oral tradition through modern mass media. And that's an interesting tension, I think, between, on the one hand, an idea to preserve African oral tradition on the one hand, and also using the modern tools to disseminate these to create a strong sense of community in different African states. My own interest in this relates, on the one hand, to some of the people who were involved in making this archive of establishing the archive of African oral traditions. They were historians, but also intellectuals of different kinds. I mentioned some of them in the paper. They were keen to challenge some of these still prevailing ideas that Africa was a continent without a history, which also was part of challenging the idea that history had to be written primarily from written sources, which was part of sort of a disciplinary prejudice that they were keen to challenge. Another important dimension was also, if we can use a term by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that there was also a strong drive, what he calls a quest for relevance among this generation of intellectuals. And a part of this was also to establish this archive as a resource in, I would say, nation building as well. So these are some of the reasons why I'm interested in these agents, and they are also really interesting in many ways, because this is really also sparked a lot of discussions about what they refer to as African ways of knowing, African approaches to history, and how they would fit into wider disciplinary basis. And I think this is something that we are still having a lot of these discussions at the moment in sort of in decolonial thought about pluriverse epistemologies, about having more inclusive ways of knowing. And I think there is a long history of this debate, which for many, at least in the decolonial field, is not, they don't know, so it's not so well known. And I think there's a really interesting resource and a lot of great ideas that came out in the 60s from some of these scholars that were related to UNESCO. So that's part of it as well. Then I would also like to mention another aspect, which is I also try to mention in the paper, is that I'm also interested in some of the technologies that were used, actually the proper hardware that was used to make these archives of oral traditions, which meant tape recording, but also later audiovisual equipment that were being used, and what was the epistemological status of these modern technologies in relation to recording African oral traditions at a time when, and this was sort of a wide agreement among those involved in the project, that this was sort of a last moment to salvage these traditions. They were disappearing rapidly as sort of the processes of modernization or modernity was spreading, or African oral traditions were threatened. But the modern tools of tape recording might be the way where we could save some of these traditions for the future as well. So another tension here as well. So interested in the agents and their ideas, their quest for relevance, how they understood their engagement with African oral traditions, and I'm also interested in the technology and how these technologies were seen as important epistemological tools for building an archive that was not only about the past, but also very much about a past that would be useful for the future and for nation building and for creating new ideas about how could new African nations or the African continent, or how, depending on what type of Pan-Africanism that was in play here, what kinds of future that could be created and what kind of past that would serve a purpose for that future. So these discussions revolved to a large extent also within these archival practices. So just one point, I guess, to finish would be that archives concern the past, but they are constructed by people who have an agenda for the future. So I think these relations between past and present in archival making and in archival use are an extremely interesting thing to explore. Yeah, so I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much. The next panelist will be Nusima Udo, who won the 2019 Africa Thesis Award, and he's from the University of Western Cape.
All right. I want to say thank you for the privilege to be enlisted in this panel. Thank you to all those that had contributed one way or the other to make this presentation very possible. I want to give a special thanks to Maria Huber. We earlier communicated on email, and I showed my appreciation. Really, the first time we met on a podcast, I was so engrossed with my thesis that I didn't really remember to check on identity, but yeah, that has been cleared. My presentation is in regard to my master's thesis and also my ongoing doctoral work, which is 21st century cultural self-reinvention, Mbokpo ritual, and Calabar Festival in southern Nigeria. So it's trying to challenge the age-long assumptions that have been held for a very long time regarding the identity of Africa. It's an extensive pursuit that I've been holding on for a while, which scholarship, like what I just been presented before now, is trying to bring to the fore that Africa has a history. And so I realized that there has been a misconception about the idea of Africa over a very long period of time, and this endures even unto the present. And so, and there is a historical connection to that, where previous Western writers and scholars and anthropologists and the kinds, had given an image of Africa without an in-depth understanding of the specificities of the cultural norms of these people. So it became very important for me to, in a very short way, use my last research and the ongoing to bring to the fore that Africans have over the years been self-inventive, not really an instrument of Western Eurocentric confines. Before now there have been claims, which is very popular in ethnicity studies and in cultural studies, that African are products of Western inventions. But I'm saying that within the contemporary, there are frameworks which we can look at how this self-endowment has been ongoing. For instance, I looked at the Mbokpo ritual, which had historically been, but which is now being redefined in the contemporary to portray their identity of Africa, subtly Nigeria, and then the Effiks, and also in a short form, also which I didn't put in my paper, show that the ongoing Calabar Carnival and Festival, which are in 2004, is also a platform to which this assertion can be built upon. If you look into history from, let's say, the early 19th century, after slavery, and even during the period of slavery, there have been discourses around the consent or the descent of African actors during the time of slave trade. But I realized from my research that within the Cross River region, the Calabar Entreport, the AFIX had a competitive trade engagement during slavery with the Europeans, and even defined terms of trade, right? Which I'm sure was not, I wasn't able to put in my paper because of that time of the pandemic. And even after that, that terms of trade continued. And when there was a transition into legitimate trade because of the drive of the interest of the Europeans to get into the interior to access further raw materials as against human labor, the AFIX also defined the terms of trade and were able to translate into a new realm. And over social construct of violence, they also tried to establish a worldview which helped them to engage between the Europeans and the hinterland, and which is what eventually described the ongoing social construct of the Efik people, or the Calabar Entreport, what eventually became extremely cosmopolitan, that welcomed people of different tribes, people of different ethnic background, of nationalities, and which was eventually reincarnated during the carnival, where culture became commodified, and then the indigenous cultural platform had been brought into the international frame without any form of interpolation from the Western or the European environment. So my conclusion is, I'm sorry, right now I'm deeply engrossed with my research. I'm trying to write my dissertation to completely, it's been a little bit bearing on me. But my conclusion is that from history up to the present, Africans have been self-inventive, and we need scholars to further dig into colonial archives, dig into other sources of avenues of resources, like visual archives, like what Caspia mentioned, oral histories, to bring out this very important discourse, which also would challenge the way our African leaders are still tying to the front of the Western discourse, without looking into that specific ideas that Africa can be able to move forward without much appeal to the Western world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The next panelist will be Paola Vargas Arana of King's College London.
Okay, well, thank you very much for accepting my paper. My name is Paola. I believe I'm the only American here. I'm from Colombia. So, well, that makes a lot of difference because I'm going to talk about, of course, of America. And well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Larissa, for the insistence of presenting my paper and doing my best since I'm beginning my postdoctoral degree here in London. So, well, I'm going to divide my presentation in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about my paper, and the second part, I wish to talk like some reflections that I have done. I have here a lot of presentations here in African Gnomes, and I wish to talk to talk with you a point that I think it's important. So first, to begin with my paper, well, my intention was to integrate America into the African history, in the sense that we cannot think only Africa as a closed environment, but of course as any continent full of connections. And in the case of the transatlantic slave trade, the connections were huge. And the people who went to America, they brought with them such a strong amount of memories within themselves, and they reconstruct communities in a new way, which would be impossible many times in Africa. But it has been denied for a long time by historiography, especially by the economic line of historiography, as it has been looked to the African population that came just as commodities. So from the 16th on, there has been like a lot of transformations in Colombian historiography and in general in Latin American historiography to tackle in a new way this population, their identities. And in this last decade, it has been interesting to notice that the American documentation, and that's the main point that I wish to notice here, the American documentation of Africans is able to talk things specific that are specific of the African history. Well, I'm working with the miners in the 16th and 17th century in an inner place of New Granada, which is today Colombia. And they were sent there to extract gold. And so from like the beginning of the colonies, of the occupation of America, they brought Africans with them. And from 1580 on, it was massive, the amount of people who came. And that population, of course, answered against the oppression of slavery. And in those answers, we can see part of the African history. We can see how their memories were reincorporated, of course, in a new way, because it was not just like bringing something from the other side of the Atlantic while people were without their communities and without the environment itself. In the context of origin. So, but in any way, they were using like tools, those knowledges and those memories that they have to resist. For instance, the construction of the Maroon communities, the way they were able to flight, to withdrawal from their from the slavery and from the mines was impressive in the way that they were able to establish strong communities that were impeding the miners, the Spanish miners, to get into some points of important gold concentrations. So those areas today are still in the hands of African descent populations. And that's also important to acknowledge that today still populations of African descent are in the same places. Then also a point that I did in my paper was to talk about that sense of diaspora, that sense of that they were able to be aware that they came from another place. Of course, we cannot speak about Africa as itself because we already have read Mudimbe and all his work about the invention of Africa. But the idea of the ancestrality from the other side of the Atlantic, it's possible to look at it in the documentation, in the way they respected the elders, in the way they were not the descendants of the Africans were not keen to negotiate with the slaveholders their liberty if they did not give liberty to the Africans, which talks about the importance of the African population within the Maroon communities that they were shaping. So in many senses, we see that the population was very aware of their condition. They were answering to that. And in terms of the continuity, just to finish now what my paper is, in terms of the continuity of the African history and the clues that this American documentation gives for the African history, we can also see in their surnames, that were assigned, we can see the ethnicities. We can have some clues to where their specific origins were, and also on the waves of the slave trade and on the places that were attacked by the slave trade in specific moments of time. For instance, in the 16th century, that I'm working, the majority of the population came from West Africa, specifically from Sierra Leone River. So it's very important also to notice that when you have only Sape, Biafra, Balanta, and the surnames that I'm finding, also related to that specific history of the slave trade and to the dynamics that in the interior of the African continent were happening. Well, that should be like the part of, and in just a brief, so by this I close my presentation, and just a brief issue of a conclusion and something just to open the next debate that we will have, is that I noticed that in all my listening to many panels, I noticed that there's like a division between the ones who are studying the decolonization in terms of the humanities and the social sciences, and on the other side, there are the antique named hard sciences like engineering or agronomy, agriculture, and all those issues that are still like a step before, in my view, in terms of the concept of decolonization. Because when you listen to all the social sciences, you see how much activism there is to decolonize all these narratives. But when you see what is being done and the policies, even though the policies are now in terms of sustainability and equality conditions and things like that, even though you see that there's much more intervention in a paternalistic sense of in the negotiations between Europe and Africa, and that worries me that there's that division, that gap that still exists, and I believe that it's a channel for panels like these to bridge that gap and to see how we manage to make those science understand the deepness that decolonization means for all the countries, including the American countries, which were colonized formerly by Europe. Well, that would be just for our next step in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next panelist will be Bakail Montef of the University of Algiers.
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers and Professor Donitz for giving me the opportunity to communicate on the history of sub-Saharan Africa in ancient and medieval times. As I said before, I mean, my paper too. Donc, I forgot something. Je voudrais remercier tous les organisateurs et à leur tête le professeur Donitz de m'avoir donné cette occasion pour s'exprimer sur ce sujet qui est l'histoire de l'Afrique ancienne et médiévale. So, my paper dealt with the historiography of Africa, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, all the writings from ancient times till today, and the contribution of African scholars, especially after independence, after the emergence of new elites, such as Sheikh Anta Diop or Théophile Obenga, who corrected many aspects of African history by introducing new methods or new approaches. So, writing the African history with objectivity is that the African or scholars should take into consideration the connectivity between history and other sciences, such as the archaeology, linguistics, etc., etc. So this is why African history or sub-Saharan African was neglected by historians, and many Europeans, historians from Europe, especially in the 19th till the 19th century, believed that Africa has no history, or African history is just a footnote une référence pour l'histoire européenne, a reference to the history of Europe. We can give some examples of historians who wrote about this, about insisting on that Africa has no history. Jerton, Moni, etc., etc. So the main goal of, let's say, writing this paper is to demonstrate that Africa has history, that Africa, or that scholars should take into consideration some aspects, or let's say in French language we say utiliser d'autres sciences telles que l'archéologie, la linguistique, etc., pour pouvoir écrire l'histoire d'une manière objective dans ce domaine. So, the main thing in my paper is to demonstrate that, let's say, in Algeria, we created a laboratory called African Studies Laboratory, composed of 5 research teams dealing with sub-Saharan Africa from the ancient time to modern times. But the main thing is that the 4th team is in charge with, let's say, translating the manuscripts which were neglected by historians, manuscripts in the south of Algeria, such as at the University of the African University at Adra, or at Tindouf, or Timimoun. All these manuscripts written in Arabic or Tifina, which is the Berber Tuareg language, contain some useful information dealing with the interaction between Africans themselves. Between the Tuaregs or the Berbers and the Sahel region. So, in my paper, the 4th, let's say, section of my paper dealt with the scientific production of the African Studies Laboratory, and many books were written by the members of the laboratory, dealing with the commercial relations between Tindouf and the Sahel, or dealing with the Monomotapa and Congo kingdoms, or let's say the book, I wrote a book in 2017 entitled Research and Studies in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what is interesting there in this book is the, let's say, the African patrimony and globalization. I mean, how should Africans preserve their patrimony? By introducing new means or new technologies, especially that if we know that globalization with its positive aspects, and by introducing the TIC, I mean, les nouvelles technologies de l'information, this could help, I mean, scholars to rewrite the African history, let's say, with objectivity. And there are many, many fields neglected till today, especially the manuscripts in the south of Algeria. They are written in Arabic. And sometimes, even if they are translated, it's a bad translation. This is why, let's say, my laboratory is working in partnership with some institutions such as the University of Adrar in casting light on many aspects and correcting, let's say, some historical facts, I mean, dealing with the ancient and medieval Africa. And let's say I dealt with, as well, I also dealt with the contribution of the Arab scholars, such as Ibn Khaldun, al-Mas'udi, or al-Umari, who wrote a magnificent book in Arabic, dealing with the discovery of the New World. The role played by King Abu Bakr of Mali in discovering the New World. Je devrais être un peu bref. And let's say in my paper, you have got all the details of this thematic, the spotlights on the history of ancient and medieval Africa. Merci beaucoup et à la prochaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The next panelist will be Innocent Sindo of Rhodes University.
Thank you, colleagues. Was just trying to unmute myself. Thanks for such a wonderful panel. I wonder how many minutes, by the way, I have got?
10 minutes.
Okay, my name is Innocent Sindo from Rhodes University, currently Dean of Humanities at the same university, and Director of the African Studies Center. We just want to be as brief as possible to this long paper that I did, just assuming that you all had an opportunity to look at it, if you luckily had the time to do so. I'm talking about the process of writing history beyond Trevor Roper. Basically, this is a kind of a historiographical take that I try to do, noting that there was a younger generation that did not quite understand the different historical trends in the writing, the different historiographical trends in the writing about and of Africa, as it were. So I presented this as a keynote elsewhere, and I thought that it would be important that we talk further about this. But just to get you in the loop, many of you would know who Trevor Roper was, but Trevor Roper was, in fact, a very highly celebrated historian of modern Europe. Basically, he was quite a celebrity scholar who appeared a lot on the British Broadcasting Corporation in the rest of the 1960s on a particular TV program. So he reduced his broadcast talks into a book which was called The Rise of Christian Europe, which was written around 1964 and published in 1965. So in that book, there appears one of his chapters called The Stages of Progress, which was, in my view, one of the worst affront to Africans at that point. And this talk started off as an attempt, of course, to defend the focus on the teaching of European history in the universities in response to young students who were claiming at that time that they needed a curricular transformation and curricular change so that they would be made aware of some of the stuff that were happening in Africa at that particular moment. So he says, and I want to quote at this point, I quote his argument: undergraduates, seduced as always by the changing breadth of journalistic fashion, demand that they should be taught the history of Black Africa. Perhaps in the future, there will be some history, some African history to teach, but at present there is none, or very little. There is only a history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America, and darkness is not a subject for history. So he actually touched a storm by that kind of statement. And then he went on to try to defend it. I don't want to go further into that because it's a long defense that he had to make to that particular statement he had made. So it could be said generally that Trevor Roper actually assumed that there was no serious professional African historical work that had been done up to the moment of his time in the 1960s. Yet in fact, we are aware from Africa that the writing of African history did not necessarily start in the 1960s with the Africanists who then were part of the chairs that emerged. But there were some existing African historians or people who were writing about the African past in many parts of Africa, in South Africa, in Kenya, in parts of West Africa, and so on. People had already started writing a lot of aspects about the African past. Whether you call them African historians or not, but that could be an issue for debate. Others would probably prefer to call them antiquarians or whatever they would like to call them. But in examining Trevor Roper's thought, it is clear from our argument that his issue, Trevor Roper, was not necessarily about whether there is anything that has been written about the African past, but that he had fundamental issues about Africa and Africans in most cases. And I do want to think that he would have almost qualified to be what is called a neo-social Darwinist of some sort, or a belated one for that matter. So his speech, I think, need to be unpacked, because the speech and the talk that there was no history of Africa, because it is so pregnant of meaning, and it is this meaning that we may need to try to find ways of trying to unpack. But what Trevor Roper thought here was that, look, there would be naturally curiosity, mainly from people like sociologists, anthropologists, and so on. But presently, there was nothing of interest to historians of his time. So in other words, he thought, and he held this position because he thought that there was nothing in the past that would arouse the curiosity of the writers of Africa and that of Africans, because of his fundamental belief that history was tied to the idea of progress or to the idea of upward mobility. So for him, history is always purposeful. It was a measure of human progress. It was a measure of human upward mobility. So by his imagination, a monopoly of the civil, it was a monopoly of the civilized. In this, then, one can trace, therefore, the conceptions of the relationship between history, patriotism, and personal pride. And I think that it is this very idea of progress which was, in fact, located in Hegelian thought. So they thought that there was nothing that was worthy of attention in Africa because there was nothing that the Africans would be proud of. His Hegelian idea was based on the assumption of Hegel himself, and I quote Hegel's work in The Philosophy of Right, where he said, African kingdom of his time, African kingdoms of his time represented the original state of human political evolution, and that the alleged lack of political evolution in this kingdom rendered them outside history. So in other words, that extreme Eurocentricism actually mirrored the political context of Europe of his time. But his arguments, Trevor Roper's arguments about African history, were coming at a particularly wrong time. It was a time of decolonization, and because of that, it would have been actually an affront for Africans who were having to find something to legitimize the calls for decolonization. The Africans were working hard in terms of their writings to prove that actually Africans had a history, we had organized the states, organized economies, and so forth and so forth. And Roper's argument then was really pouring water to the fire that was really emerging in that time. So you begin to see then that at that time when Trevor Roper was making this argument, universities were already going through a period of change, universities in England. There were some of them beginning to open up academic chairs in African history. Places like Birmingham, places like Cambridge, places like the very Oxford where Trevor Roper was. And you see that he was actually out of sync with the realities of his time, as it were. And it is during this time that there emerged a very, very strong Africanist historiography. We have the Dar es Salaam School, we have the Ibadan School, and we had the Makerere School, and so forth. And we had something also of a similar nature happening in South Africa. And therefore, you could see the scholars that emerged in that time were so hell-bent on trying to prove that Trevor Roper was wrong and that what he was saying was complete bullshit. But you can see, sorry, excuse me for that word, but you can see then that Trevor Roper had gotten into their nerves. And in fact, I would argue that by that controversial talk that he did, he had actually agenda-setted. He had agenda-setted the representation of African history, because then the scholars who were responding to him were in fact responding within his, he had taken the ball into, they had taken the ball into his courts, and therefore, in fact, they were playing Trevor Roper's ball. So I would argue then that the Africanist scholars and Africanist historiography was bent actually on playing and pandering to the whims of Trevor Roper because they were answering his questions, instead of actually arousing independent and completely different questions to try to prove a different problematic altogether. So what I'm trying to say then and suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is that the beginning of academic and professional African history began first and foremost, with this kind of very strong Trevor-European agenda setting approach, which they had to respond ultimately to. And therefore, you could see then that the developments in African history going forward from the 1960s mirror a kind of a reaction to a previous argument that had been provoked by other scholars. Although the scholars of the 1960s did very well in demonstrating that Africa had sophisticated kingdoms, sophisticated religious systems of trade and so on, they actually forgot to think very strongly about the African economies. They forgot to think very strongly about the African religions. They forgot to think strongly about other aspects of African societies, which became a central problematic for those who arose and began to write in the 1970s. But the 1970s were triggered more about a kind of an anomaly that they began to see in Africa. The beginning of economic collapse following the oil crisis in the rest of the world, which impacted Africa very much in that agriculture became very expensive. So people began to think about, but why is this massive economic development that had happened in Africa no longer the case now, and it's faltering, etc., etc. Now, there arose, colleagues, the development of underdevelopment school. The attempt to actually explain the fact that the collapse of African economies and the failure of post-independent African economies to perform had a lot to do with the politics of underdevelopment or the economies of underdevelopment, which we all know about. I mean, Walter Rodney, Paul Baran, Paul Sweeney, Andre Gunda Frank, and all that kind of scholarship arising in that time. But there also arose a very strong a group of people influenced by very strongly Marxian ideas who sought to look at the African economy. And therefore, you could see from the late 80s, 70s, and going into the 1980s, the emergence of labor studies, the emergence of issues of mining history and stuff like that. So what you could see then is that the development of African history, generally speaking, had a lot to do with questions that were not necessarily being asked in Africa itself, but there were questions being asked globally about Africa's economic performance and how we could try to explain it and so forth. So African history was not written from the point of view of the very interest of the continent itself, but it was more to do with attempting to come up with global explanations of why Africa was in the state that it was in. And so getting to the 1980s and the later 1990s, we'll begin to see then an interest in African social histories and so on, and African environmental histories. This had to do, obviously, with the work that was going on at UNESCO, the issue of environmentalism, and the issue of attempting to explain and understand the African social settings, especially in the light of a growing urban spaces and increasing social vulnerabilities due to collapsed economies of the 1980s. So,
Innocent, I have to cut you off.
I will stop. Thank you.
This is very fascinating. I also, when I was reading your paper, so thank you a lot, but maybe you can save more thoughts for the discussion later. Thank you.
I apologize. Thank you.
No worries.
So our next panelist, thank you so much. First of all, our next panelist will be Marie Hoover of Humboldt University of Berlin.
Yeah, so I actually appreciate, Innocent, that you went over time a little bit, because that way I don't have to elaborate so much on what, as you could all see, is really still very much in its early stages. So during my dissertation research, where I looked into the history of the UNESCO World Heritage Program in Ethiopia, and I didn't start and I want to take the time to explain this. I did not start with an interest in African countries per se. So I do think that I offer a kind of an interesting perspective as someone who kind of stumbled across this topic, because I was interested first in UNESCO's work, and then I came across the Ethiopian example because Ethiopia had the largest number of World Heritage nominations, actually among all the countries, not only among African countries, when the UNESCO World Heritage Program started. So the more I looked into this, the more I looked into the history of these sites, I understood that World Heritage sites at the time of the program, so that would be the 70s, the 1970s, had a particular relevance for Ethiopian politics, and that the politics of history had a particular relevance well, in a global context, in an international context, but also for Ethiopia in a national context, in a regional context, in a Pan-African context. So for me, this was really opening the door to a whole new perspective of a very complex and entangled history, but from basically not a European viewpoint, but from an African viewpoint. And I really want to make the case also with this paper that I would like to write on the history of museums in Africa, that this is very well possible through UNESCO, even though it's technically considered by some people a Western institution. But we have heard other papers today. And I was lucky enough to have to conduct an interview in December with Aklilu Habde, who was the Ethiopian, the head of the Ethiopian delegation to UNESCO. He was also part of the Commission for the General History of Africa. He made it very clear to me that in his understanding, UNESCO by the 1960s, by the entering of the new African nation states, was very much a platform for African issues as well as for other issues. So I also want to make the case that that to look at UNESCO here as a Western institution is just not appropriate, and that the documents in its archive are very rich. So then I want to say very quickly a few words about the museum reports, or just to give you a brief impression of technically what I'm looking at. When I say mission report, what is it, what actually happens? The official protocol is that any member country of UNESCO can request assistance. So officially speaking, the starting point or the initiative always comes from the country itself, from the national government. However, when you look into the cases, very often you will find that people who worked in the UNESCO Secretariat, so the international bureaucrats working for UNESCO and specialists working for UNESCO, also made a lot of effort to stimulate what they call in their language, stimulate requests. So when UNESCO decided to roll out a program, they also made sure to advertise it, so to speak, to governments or to national governments who they thought this could be of interest to. But it is very important to understand that the national government had a lot of say in who would then come to the country and do what kind of work. Yeah, it was not at all just shaped by a vague hegemonic agenda of Western experts. And by the way, when you look at the history of African historic institutions through the lens of UNESCO, you can also see that making a difference between African and Western actors doesn't necessarily make sense, because every single African actor that I looked into had received their academic training and credentials in institutions in Europe or in the US. So I think they were just as convinced. And we have heard some example of the scientific methods that we're speaking about, the scientific methods of conservation, the scientific methods of, museum studies, or how to build up a museum and what the purpose of a museum is. And this is why I think we need new or different ways of differentiating when we tell these stories. And I like a lot what Kalpana said in her presentation, that we should make an effort to not homogenize certain groups like basically lump them in, because that can also obscure, well, agendas or agencies and motivations of people. Then one last point that I want to draw your attention to, because I think it's very fruitful for discussion, is that so what both African intellectuals, African academic actors, and Western academic actors, so I'm talking here about conservation scientists, architects, historians, what they shared is that the tenet that the awareness of culture and heritage is something that needs to be brought and taught to the African people. This is what I get from my sources, at least, and this is what I read. What I read in the discussions that took place, and this is something I think is worth looking into. The kind of, well, tensions, and really making more of an effort to look at shared viewpoints and tenets of certain actors, because they may not necessarily align with a simple, well, West African or also inner African tensions. But it's more worth looking, into this what Innocent has just mentioned in this discussion, looking at also into the philosophy and theory of history that is underpinning people's work at the time. I guess that's what I would have to say for the moment, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The final panelist that will present in this round will be Larissa Schouten Nordholt from Leiden University.
Thank you. I think I'll keep it brief as well, since we're probably all looking forward to a little break. I'll briefly present my paper, and then one of the main issues that I struggle with in this paper, but also just in my doctoral work generally. So I work on the 8-volume General History of Africa, the UNESCO General History of Africa, which has already been mentioned by some people. And this was a endeavor, I argue, which was both scholarly in that it wanted to, in reaction to Trevor Roper, I might add, wanted to create reputable scholarly African history, but it was also a politically engaged project that was interested in, the emancipation of Africans and nation building in Africa. So it was all about the Africanization of the writing of African history. And so my article that I wrote has attempted to show how the UNESCO General History developed scholarly standards, while it was at the same time grappling with the political tension that was part of a move away from European historiography, which was connected to anti-colonialism, of course, in that time. And so it was specifically while editing the chapter written by Sheikh Anta Diop, who we've also already heard of, on the origins of the ancient Egyptians, that political imperatives seems to clash with what the general history had deemed standards of academic rigor and scholarly methods. So while the general history was engaged in the creation of new research standards for the writing of African history, it was also concerned with political emancipation of both Africans as well as African history as a reputable scholarly activity. So within the general history, scholarly standards had developed in such a way that explanations that referenced Eurocentric or colonial ideas or theories were seen as bad historical work. So Eurocentrism, the kind of thought that Trevor Roper also had, equaled bad scholarship. And of course it still does, but it became one of the guiding ideals of the general history. And that meant avoiding explanations which placed the primacy of African history outside of the continent based on outdated or disproved theories. But at the same time, the general history also tried to stay mindful of outside influences that did withstand the test of what they thought was sound historical work. So this meant avoiding also explanations that hinged on race as an explanatory factor, as the general history wanted to deracialize history as well. So the various incarnations that were identified as hemithic, according to the general history, did both and were therefore banned entirely from the work, at least in rhetoric. Diop's contribution, however, withstood the test of peer review, even despite the fact that many general history of Africa historians did not agree with the substance of Diop's argument, nor did they agree or condone his methods, which were based on physical anthropology. They included the chapter nonetheless, however, precisely because it dealt with very important questions of emancipation, with questions of meaning within African history that could not be avoided. In arguing that for the African origins of Egyptian civilization, Dibet made the very basic recognition that African history was African, and this was very important. It should be noted that the general history of Africa did not necessarily succeed in what post-colonial thinkers have deemed the provincialization of Europe, in that it did not entirely move away from categories of explanation that hinged on deracializing or Africanizing African history is different from decolonizing it in the decolonial sense of the word, as has been said by Ndlovu Gatsheni, who was also talking at this conference. So in a way, my paper and my work are equally about African historiography as much as they are about the conceptual legacy of European historiography in Africa. So the general history asserted that a decolonization of history should take as a point of departure the authenticity and autonomy of people to define for themselves what it meant to write history, what it meant to write African history, and what scholarly standards were a part of that. But it remained difficult to decolonize the writing of African history and create African history as a reputable scholarly endeavor within the Euro-American Academy, because it wasn't always clear how politically engaged move away from Eurocentrism could be combined with detached scholarship. So that's the gist of my argument for now. And the problem I want to present to you today is conceptual in nature. I've argued that the general history combined politics and academics, but I also firmly believe that in some respect, all history does. All history combines politics and academics in a way, I think. Although we don't always notice this, when the politics of a historical project overlap with the political status quo of a country or even a time period. So my question to you is whether it is confusing to try to separate history and politics, academics and politics within the history of the general history of Africa, within a project that was so closely intertwined with the political history of decolonization, with the move away from empire. And I think this is something that we have touched on throughout the panels, or throughout the papers for this panel. There's been a strong sense of revisionist history. You know, the idea that African history always needs to be in response to biased historiography, often produced in Europe and away from a Euro-American center. So following Anderson's contribution also, I want to argue that African historiography in a way has been saddled with a legacy of politicization. You know, the perpetual reaction to Trevorrow is still the continuing need to state that Africa has a history, even though one would say that by now we have made that statement over and over and over again. It's the very first sentence actually within the general history of Africa. So there's always this perpetual reaction still to Eurocentrism, which Terence Ranger has called the mirror image of imperialist historiography. So in a way, it seems to be almost always inherently political when one engages in African historiography, more so than in any other type of historiography, as far as I've noticed in my relatively short career. How then do we depoliticize African history and historiography? Or should we even want to? Do we need to depoliticize African historiography? Is that even something that can be done? And I would like to close with something that I heard during one of the other panels of this conference. Someone introduced me to the concept of West-splaining. You know, the idea sort of brother concept to the idea of mansplaining. You know, the idea that historical context can be simply transported from European context to elsewhere, can be simply pasted onto non-Western context to explain historical phenomena. So that you don't need to look at the African context. And of course, that is something that we've all been refuting, and all of the 8 papers that we've just heard have said, no, we do need to do that. But somehow we are still always caught in this paradox of having to explain ourselves, of having to Africa-splain, which I'm not sure I can even say, not being an African. But so I would like to end with that conundrum of politicization, of, the idea that African history always has to explain itself in some way. These are very, very new thoughts, very underdeveloped thoughts also, but I hope to harvest some good critique on my paper and on this idea of politics and academia within African history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone on this panel. We will now enter a break, and I will see all of you in half an hour. Thank you for everybody who already engaged in the chat. Please continue to do so, because we will record this and we'll also see how we can, use all of this as an input to take the discussion further. So even if you write something in the chat and we're not engaging with it, or no one is engaging with it, it's not lost, and it's not for nothing. So we appreciate every comment and every input made here. So I hope you can all have a bit of a break and come back.
So we're going to return not in the hour that it says here, but at 5:30.
Yes, we had to move around the logistics and the schedule a little bit. Yes, you're right. Okay. So everybody, it's true. Originally, we said that we will continue at 5:15, and we decided to move things around a little bit, and we will meet again at 5:30 Central European time. So in 30 minutes from now, that is 5:30 for me, and maybe a different time for some of you. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone who was already here for the first part. As in the first panel, I will give you a brief introduction or a brief run through. We will start this panel with a comment by Adam Getachew, who joined us from Chicago, and I will introduce her shortly. And then after that, we have planned about 20 minutes for direct responses and discussion from the panelists, some of which may, as far as there are some direct questions, or so to give each panelist the opportunity for an individual statement. And then we have another 20-25 minutes of time where we can have a more open discussion. Both parts of the discussion, Larissa will moderate and call on people to speak, to keep it organized a little bit. But yeah, and this also, the second part of the discussion is really the part where we will also respond and pick up some of the questions that have come up in the chat already in the first part of the session, and everybody can still see it there in the chat, but Sol will also assist us pointing out these questions. And then at the end, I will try to do a very brief summary, and I will announce the movie. So just to make it interesting to stay until the end. Yeah, I will try to summarize in 5 or 10 minutes with the discussions and the presentations of today. So I want to start by once again really thanking Adam for making it possible, despite the busy schedule and circumstances in general at the moment, to come and join us and take the time, read through all the papers. Adam is currently, and I hope I'm saying this right, Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She studies modern political thought of 19th and 20th century, and her recent book, or not so recent anymore, 2018 book, World Making After Empire, has been very, very broadly discussed and been taken up in this book. And I think what is the reason why this book was discussed so broadly is because she's focusing. In the book, she focused in a new and innovative way, so to speak, on Black and post-colonial political theory of African independence leaders and the Black Atlantic intellectual tradition. We invited her for a comment on this panel because we both, Larissa and I, found that we share an interest in the politics of history in the post-colonial period in Africa. And while on the one hand, nationalist claims were in need of a historiographic production to underwrite and legitimate them, on the other hand, Adam's work has drawn attention to the fact that there was a distinct international critique and global outlook that can easily be overlooked, but that certainly shaped the intellectual discourse on African historiography just as much. So I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts and comments on the papers that we had and the question of, historiography in post-colonial Africa. Thank you. Adam, you have the word.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the invitation, Marie and Larissa. It's a pleasure to be joining you. I'm sorry I missed the first part of your conversation, but very excited to jump in. I mean, as Larissa's introduction makes clear, I'm not officially a historian, though deeply in conversation with history, and very much think that the kind of work I do of political theory, history of ideas, really requires an engagement and a grounding in historical specificity and context. So I'm very happy to be here with you all and to be in this conversation. I wanted to organize my questions. So instead of trying to discuss each of the papers separately, I sort of picked out some broad themes, and one of them, so I'll just list them now and then go through them. One is kind of the critique of Eurocentrism and what the problem of Eurocentrism is. The second, I think all of the papers are interested in this question of how to decolonize history, and what the relationship between knowledge production and that moment of decolonization was, in fact. A third about the relationship between history and heritage, or history and memory, which has, of course, come up a lot in our own moment as well. And then maybe a fourth question about the uses of the past, the political and various uses through that draw us to history. So I'll start with the Eurocentrism. I mean, I think 3 of the 8 papers, maybe more, all touched on the Trevor Roper and a variety of kind of early, maybe still persistent. I think one, I forget which, Monsef paper also tied that point to a more recent Sarkozy comment about Africa has no history. So there's that version of Eurocentrism, which I think is a lot of the papers are responding with, engaging with, and naming. And then I think there's a second kind of Eurocentrism that is less about a denial of African history than a way of doing African history through the conceptual categories of the West. And so this seems to be like a deeper level of Eurocentrism in some way, that are kind of categories of analysis, are conceptual frameworks, even as we're interested in doing the recovery of African pasts, is articulated through categories that are not our own. This came up, I think, most prominently in a sense paper, who's not here with us today, but for instance, in the discussion about how this category of the state becomes the framework through which pre-colonial African political formations are read, or in Casper's paper around the question of the archive, right? That there's a recognition of oral traditions as the basis of African histories, yet that oral tradition must be rendered legible through the framework of the archive, and through the modernizing and modernist structure of the archive. So, I think it's worth, in some ways, disentangling these 2 forms of Eurocentrism, because I think they require different kinds of responses, I guess. And I thought one thing we can talk about is just how we think especially about the second question, how our own kind of conceptual categories and frameworks are structured by the legacies of Eurocentrism. What that means for, I guess, both what that means for a critique of Eurocentrism and our own practices of scholarship. Second, I think, so I'm moving on now to the decolonization theme and the decolonization of knowledge. I think a lot of the papers really emphasize and highlight the ways in which that moment of decolonization, the post-war period, which stretches into the 1980s and 90s in Southern Africa and in South Africa in particular, was a moment in which political actors, intellectuals thought very seriously about the question of the decolonization of knowledge. So I think one really upshot of the papers presented is to remind us that this contemporary, what feels like a contemporary conversation about decolonizing the university, decolonizing knowledge, decolonize the curriculum, all of these have a kind of, we're already being debated and framed what people thought the project of decolonization was in that period that we associate with formal decolonization. I think this is incredibly important. It gives us a sense of like, one, I think it's useful for those people who are engaged in this project in the contemporary moment to kind of revisit these earlier histories, to remember kind of what might be some of their kind of limits, and I'll get to that in a second, and how we might approach this task of decolonizing knowledge differently. So I think one limit about that earlier period, I think many papers pointed to, is the ways this project was, embedded in a certain kind of nationalist framework and the silences and erasures that this creates. So in Kalpana's paper, the silences around women's agency and women's roles in the struggle for liberation. In the kind of, in Marie's paper, the ways in which heritage sites, especially in the Ethiopian case, are produced and produced in such a way that privileges a certain reading of Ethiopian history, one that privileges the North, that privileges the Christian heritage, etc. So those are kind of some of the limits of, one kind of limit, I guess, about the nationalist response. And then I think, I found really interesting in Larissa's paper, the ways in which the critique of Eurocentrism requires redeploying the tools of Eurocentrism, especially racialism, in Sheikh Anta Diop's work on the Black reading Egyptian civilization as an African civilization. I think that seems to be, again, like a reoccurring trope of kind of Black and African responses to the history of Eurocentrism, is that in order to, and Du Bois does the same thing in World and Africa, and he has this very strange formulation. He says, he reinforces, he makes the case that Egyptians are Black, and then he's like, well, like, obviously you can't really, no one knows, none of these are pure. There is no pure Black, yellow, or white race. But if Europeans can say Egypt is white, why can't I say Egypt is Black, right? So, there's this kind of, whatever, maybe we can call it a strategic essentialism or something like that. But, and then I think there's a third question that comes up in Paula's paper and Monsef's paper about what are the methods we actually bring to bear when trying to decolonize history. And in particular, both really emphasize this question of interdisciplinarity, the ways in which we need an emphasis on oral traditions, on archaeology. In Paula's paper, there's also an interest in the gastronomic as part of a way of trying to highlight African continuities and retentions in the New World. I guess one kind of question about the project of decolonization or decolonizing knowledge in this period is that it seems to me, at least, to be wedded to a verificationist framework, right? That we're trying to find evidence of Black civilization, or we're trying to find evidence of African retentions in in the New World, or we're trying to like locate agency in marginalized figures. And so I wonder, I mean, it's like, what kinds of burdens does the verificationist framework create, right, for those actors and for ourselves? And I wonder if there are other ways to imagine what that task of decolonization is beyond this kind of strategies of verification. I'm happy to say more about that. The third theme was this question of history, history as heritage or memory. And Seema is not here, but I was really interested in that paper on this question as well. But, I think, again, I feel like these set of questions about heritage and tradition and how people make uses of it is again deeply tied to the set of conversations we're having in the contemporary moment about African heritage, repatriation of objects, and ones we're having also in the context of the United States vis-a-vis indigenous heritage. So, I mean, I'll just put these questions out here, although I think Seema's not here, but I think one of the things that was really fascinating about the paper on the television show is this way in which a particular, practice taken to be a traditional practice is reimagined by, a consuming public, a TV viewing public. And in some ways, I wondered about how we might think about that consumption, production, performance of heritage alongside the kinds of heritage sites, say, that Marie is talking about. I found particularly interesting in the TV show this, why a kind of a cast that's like, traverses boundaries, right, is drawn from across the African continent. The kind of uses of 19th century European dress alongside this investment in a very particular cultural site, I think is really interesting. And, in the kind of question about the heritage sites that Marie talks about, I was very interested in what the kind of heritage as a site of politicization, I guess. And I think there were 3 papers on UNESCO, and what was just really interesting to think about, and of course it's something I care quite a lot about, is how these kind of national and nationalist projects are made possible through this whole regime of international institutions, and what the interaction is between these international bodies and international expertise and these kind of local conditions. Okay, I'll say one more thing. And I think this is just an open question about the uses of the past. So, Innocent Masindo in that paper has a line that's, we don't study history for amusement, but to understand who we are. And in some ways, what's like that moment of decolonization and decolonizing knowledge is about creating national independence, Pan-Africanism. And so it's just a question to ask. I guess this is me as a political theorist. For me, I'm interested in particular histories to illuminate a set of present predicaments or something like that. And I think that there's this deep connection between the kinds of histories we tell and the ways in which we understand our present political moment. So it's just a question for all of you about how you think about the histories you're writing and doing in connection to the present. Like, what animates or motivates this set of histories and this set of interests vis-a-vis a kind of contemporary African predicament. So I'll just stop there and look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Adam. That certainly gave me a lot to think about. And I can respond right away, but I want to give other people the chance to respond first before I start talking. Yes, Monsef, go ahead. You can go ahead and give your response. You're still muted though, so there we go. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Let's say that in order to write African history or ancient and medieval African history, scholars should deal with other specialties or sciences, such as archaeology, oral history, linguistics, etc., etc. So I realized that we focus on the general history of Africa. But in my point of view, we forget that there is a contribution, or the main contribution, of European universities in writing African history. Let's say, for example, Cambridge History of Africa. We have got 7 or 8 volumes. And as I used to be a student at Exeter University, so I used this, let's say, general history of Africa issued by Cambridge. My main subject, or my thesis, dealt with the East African history at that time. Secondly, I forget his name. I mean, professor who left a while ago. What's his name?
Innocent.
I said that the professor who left the Sounds a while ago. What's his name?
His name is Innocent. I think you mean Innocent, who wrote about Trevor Roper? Or
no, from South Africa.
Yeah, that's Innocent.
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 Yeah.
No, I mean that he said that my question. Where is it? About Africanists in the 60s and 70s, ou l'afrocentrisme, yeah. He said that many African countries suffered from the collapse, or the Africans. He said that there was a collapse in African economy after oil prices went down. You mean it's 1973, I think. But and he said that the Africans didn't give more, let's say, much importance to sociology or sociological aspects and economic aspects. So I disagree with him, because the crisis of 1973 was provoked by Algeria, in my country, by President Houari Boumediene. I mean, when he said that the African economy suffered after the collapse of the prices of oil, I said I disagree. Why? Because all the African countries were third, let's say, are still third world, not developed. And many African countries were under Portuguese colonialism, such as Angola, Mozambique, Sao Tome. Southern Africa, I mean South Africa and Namibia today, were under the, let's say, the supremacy of the white minority. So maybe South Africa suffered because there was an embargo, and Algeria initiated the embargo against South Africa. That country practiced at that time, let's say, the apartheid. So, I mean that African economies did not suffer because Algeria initiated, let's say, many programs of development with many, let's say, African countries. And Algeria organized, let's say, the first Pan-African festival in 1967. And in that festival, many liberation movements attended that festival, as well as many presidents and leaders of African countries. So it can be said that at that time, it was a new era because the emergence, let's say the emergence of the neocolonialism, had made many African countries to be non-alienated, not to the bloc. I mean, the socialist bloc or the capitalist bloc. And President Boumediene, who was, in my point of view, the best president, I mean, in Algeria, because he was a president, let's say, from 1965 to 1978. He was the president who initiated the dialogue, the famous dialogue between the North and the South. And when I say third word about African countries, because African countries has no technologies, and even
I'm very sorry, Montevo. I'm going to cut you off there. I'm very sorry to do so, but I think we have a few other responses as well before we get through the entire hour. But thank you for your response so far. Let's see if we can get back to that later. I think Casper also raised his hand.
Okay, then.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much, Adam, for these comments. I just had a response sort of to the last thing about the relevance of our contributions here, as I see them at least, and I'm very much sort of in line with that this is the importance of the need to insist that the idea to decolonize knowledge, or the need to decolonize knowledge, has a history, and I think that's very much the starting point for sort of that why I work on this. And I think also specifically, again, I'm based in Denmark. When we talk about this, we get a lot of the theories from South America, from the decoloniality modernity school. We don't hear so much about the debates that have been going on in Africa and among African academics for many decades now. So that's also part of it. I think sometimes we get a very even sort of, there's sort of the few figures we hear about are just Ngugi and Fanon, but there are so many other voices that have some really important ideas that deserve to be brought forward again. And I guess I see this as sort of as an intellectual historian, sort of, I guess, in sort of a Quentin Skinner kind of thing, that it's about that we need these voices to challenge sort of if our thoughts gets too narrowed or too bogged down, then history can be a resource to rethink and open vocabularies in new ways. And just a final thing would be also the reason why I'm incensed that to change things, you needed also to look at institutional change. that it was not just about changing discourses, it's also about changing institutions. And many of these people invested time in the institutions to do so, to develop curricula, new programs in ecology, and many of these things. And I find that intellectual engagement with institutional change and the wish to do so also something that's very important. Experiences and also the limitations that were experienced here, something that's well worth digging up again and think about again. So that was sort of my response to that specific question. But thank you very much for the comments also.
Thank you, Kasper. Thank you very much. I think UNESCO is a red thread throughout a lot of these papers, which is interesting. I think Marie, who also had a lot to say about UNESCO, would like to respond as well.
Yeah, and I want to thank Kasper for the cue of institutional change, because this is something that, well, struck me most profoundly after I had started to study the Ethiopian case, because also one of my original questions was, how is such an international convention implemented in then in a developing country or in a country of the global south? And I was really struck to find, well, the deep, just how deeply, and at first I called it invasive, but I'm not sure I would use that word again, because it implies a kind of hierarchy that I would now question whether it was actually there or whether the process was so one-sided. Just to give a more concrete example, to draft the legislation of heritage and antiquities, upon the request of the Ethiopian government, a UNESCO mission sent a Polish legislation expert to draft the legislation that was then passed in the Ethiopian parliament. And for me, I was just very, and then I learned that this was actually not uncommon, not only for the area of cultural law, but for all kinds of more specialized or technical law, to invite legislation experts to draft legislations. And so for me, it shows that also the question of the cultural institutions, the emerging or maybe reinvented cultural institutions that we look at, that this is very much embedded in the broader history of states kind of needing to build the states in a very practical sense, needing to build government infrastructure, government institutions, political institutions, economic institutions at an extremely rapid pace. And everybody who was behind this was really convinced and had a kind of, well, desire or ideas about modernizing, and how modernizing can just be something that is kind of mechanically implemented by working off a checklist. And it is interesting, I think, to ask how that has how that affects then a practice of historical scholarship, yeah, where certainly, even though you could ask this for other areas of scholarship, where there is a certain, well, philosophical and theoretical concepts that are more important maybe, or that where it's even less so possible to say it's just a neutral kind of apolitical. This is the context in which we have to look at this, and which also made this possible. Which also made possible. There was another paper. It wasn't in this conference. Larissa and I discussed it, and I have forgotten who the author was, about that explained very well how much the rise of this new African historiography in the 60s had to do with so much funding being available for African universities. And so much funding being available for African universities were built up, and then in the 70s and 80s, all that funding was just cut off, basically, and then.
Isn't that a paper by Tseletsa, Paul Tiyamba Tseletsa? Is that the one that we were talking about? He wrote about these things, I think.
Yeah, so.
But it's generally been written about. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in on you.
No, sorry. I think that wasn't so directly. I had thought originally of a more direct response to Adam's question of heritage as a site of politicization, and how well, one of the things that I have written about in my dissertation is how, yes, very much I think that the idea of getting a kind of development aid for developing cultural institutions and developing specifically a profile of heritage, of a national heritage, how this was very much welcomed. I can at least say this for the Ethiopian government, because both internally and externally, it served very much the political agenda of the days to build a strong national identity. But in reverse, UNESCO, as a young international organization that didn't have yet a very strong standing, it was really impossible to have this, to have the grounds to apply all the idealistic work that was cooked up in the headquarters. Yeah, so it was a mutually beneficial relationship, if we want to say so. And I think we can say the same for the museums, for the building up of African museums in that time as well. But I'll stop here.
Thank you. That was, I think, very interesting. I think this, way that funding and economic realities shape African historiography is something that returns in a lot of our papers too, in a way. Is there any of the other panelists? Paula, yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. How do I take away the hand?
Oh, I hadn't even seen the hand, so.
Yeah, okay. Yes, well, I want to retake also what Mary was saying, because yes, that issue of, to answer also, Adam, the fact that the state itself was designed by the West impedes us to be absolutely outsiders to construct history or to develop projects, the development projects in any sense for any part of the world, because we are all immersed. Even the Islamic countries are now like engaged in modes of state that are influenced by the European model. So, which is not totally a European model, of course, that it has roots of many parts of the model that is imperative right now. And that because you said that how to go through outside categories from the West. Well, I believe that it's more important to be aware and that to be open in which of them we are using, more than to try to overcome them, because it would be sometimes, I believe, impossible in the way that's also how our brain is structured. And then this is also related with what I was saying on the conference. Of course, that it's not, and also to answer Tom Dietz, who did a comment on my comment on the panels that I listened. Of course, that it's not all panels. There were all kind of panels, but when you see on funding, many things that Mary was saying, still you can find them on the panel. So, and it's something like on the contrary of what happened first. Here we have projects, engineer projects with lots of money, and then all that money was lost because there was nobody who developed the project. And then you see that it was there were no sufficient people who were prepared for the project, and it was, of course, a sustainability project and engage in equality and all the values of the UN today. And so it's still happening, and in like a neo-colonization that it's still in our minds, and we cannot start by the point of saying that we have overcome it, but we can also not say that it's possible to get absolutely rid. I don't know if I'm clear in that point. Well, I stop by that in this moment.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for replying to Ton's comment earlier. I think Kalpana also wanted to reply quickly. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Adam, for those very constructive comments. I think that you've summarized some of the very key issues very well. I actually wanted to allude to 2 points very quickly, and I think I see them in kind of Eurocentrism and decolonization. Kind of 2 sides of a coin, if you so to speak. You talked about conceptualizing away from the West. The fact that the right, one of the challenges of Eurocentrism is it is still articulated in categories of which are still, for example, which are not familiar, in the sense that they are still quite embedded. For me, I think one of the things that we need to do, particularly relating in the context of decolonization, is that we rethink, we reevaluate, and reframe. Coming as a historian with a strong historical background, the way in which we structure and we narrate and we write history. So the way I see it, and in my own particular research and work, is that by writing the histories of the oppressed, of the marginalized, okay, we are in the process then developing new conceptual frameworks. We are in the process of developing new research methodologies and new theoretical methods. And number 2 is that also in so doing, in writing the histories of the marginalized, remember the marginalized communities or peoples per se are not homogenized. We cannot see them as one. So when we see them as a heterogeneous group where there are nuances in their experiences and, from their backgrounds, their diverse geopolitical regions or their ethnicity, their language, whatever the case may be, when we see them in these categories, we in the process develop new ways of thinking and new ways of writing. And then also number 2, the decolonization. We talk about decolonization quite often these days, and sometimes we talk about them quite loosely, in fact, but replacing one content over the other. It is much, much more deeper. It's about your psyche of an individual, besides the academic issues relating to it, but it's also issues about identity. With these issues, we will, in the process, for example, emerge with new kind of theories and conceptual frameworks that we can work around it. I'm just, as a historian, these are just some of the issues that I grapple.
Thank you so much. I actually want to respond to that very quickly, and to Adam as well, because I do think it's a very good point to make that the term decolonization has come to mean a lot of different things, from the end of empire to decolonial thinking, the critical and actually there was I forgot who wrote it, I forget the name, maybe Ton will know. There was someone who wrote a paper for the magazine For Africa Knows about decolonization not being radical enough, and the problem with it being that it's just what Kalpana was saying, that it's about, it's become about replacing some content with other content, whereas it should possibly be about the dissecting underlying epistemologies of the histories we create, and as historians, a bit conservative in the way we approach things. So I think it's good to be mindful of that. And actually, Adam, I want to thank you very much for, at some point you said as the tools of Eurocentrism. It was very said, the fact that Eurocentrism doesn't just, it pushes us in a certain direction because we tend to respond to it. So, you know, why would it be necessary? Why would we make it important to decide what race the ancient Egyptians were? You know, well, why is that something that we even need to think about? Why do we want to put that on our agenda? I guess that is a very are we studying the things that we are studying? And I think that links to what Kalpana was saying as well, in terms of, you know, marginalization. And I think it's about being mindful of not letting Eurocentrism dictate what we are doing, which of course is what I'm doing in my work, but that is another issue altogether. All right, Sean Jacobs wrote about decolonization not being radical enough, and I think he's located in South Africa as well, right?
I think so.
Right, yeah. So I think it's interesting to be mindful about the terms that we use, and you know how decolonization has come to mean so many different things, and maybe it's a conceptual question as well. I think all the panelists that are still present have now been able to respond, I think. Yes. Are there any, we of course have a lot of questions in the chat, but I just wanted to ask first, are there any questions in the audience? Or Adam, would you like to respond briefly to what has just been said?
Well, Paula wants to jump in. Go ahead, Paula.
It's very short. It's just to return you a question that you say, and at a point that you can further that thought, that is regarding the another ways of verification on the methods that we use. So how to go further on that approach on agencies, visibility? What do you suggest then to for us to be more decolonized?
Well, especially for your paper, the kind of question about African retentions and has of course been a long debate, right? The whole 20th century of histories of thinking about African presence in the New World is about, did they bring cultural retentions? Did they lose everything in the Middle Passage? And this is, you can trace this in so many different works, right? The Herskovits and Fraser debate, later debates between Kamau Brathwaite and Orlando Patterson. So this whole kind of history of this precise question. And, I guess part of it is just to say, like, so one I'm thinking with this paper, I'll put the title in the chat, but David Scott, who's a Jamaican anthropologist and post-colonial theorist, is partly reflecting on this whole debate in the Caribbean. And his point is like, is this the kind of debate that's going to be settled through this process of verification? Like, how much evidence do we need to show to be like, oh, there were African cultural retentions, right? And is there a way to ask the question about the connection between the New World and Africa that doesn't depend so much on whether or not there were retentions, right? Another way to say it is like, for instance, across Latin America, there's been all this Black consciousness movements of, in the last, and some of which have been very successful in Brazil, in Colombia. And these are I guess what it's like, artists, activists, organizers, everyday people fashion all kinds of connections with the African continent. And those popular literary and intellectual processes of imagining a connection to Africa don't always have to depend, or don't really depend on, whether in fact that verificationist process, right? So I guess one thought is like, and it's because this is my own kind of preoccupation and interest, but is there a way to read people's own invocations of Africa, whatever those invocations might be, for how they imagine that connection, rather than trying to turn to this kind of empirical basis to say, here's the proof that there is in fact African retentions. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of what I was suggesting. And I mean, yeah, so we could imagine I mean, it makes sense why people turned to the language to try to mount evidence, right? Both for African retentions in the New World, but also for ideas of Black civilization in the context of the African continent. But it's like for our own presence, like with some distance from that nationalist moment, can there be other ways that we frame our work that doesn't depend on this kind of, I don't know, empirical proving, right? And thinks differently about, you know, I mean, I'll give another example about agency, right? So, you know, a famous kind of debate in African studies, you know, the kind of John Thornton critique of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right? His argument that book, that Rodney's book, stole or denied Africans agency in this process of the slave trade, that they had in fact been agents, and et cetera, that it's a one-sided picture. I mean, it's really, you know, there's a new book by Herman Bennett who's looking at early Portuguese and, you know, Portuguese encounters with Africa. And his point is like, I mean, it's not that Walter Rodney denies Africans agency. It's just that he doesn't think that one should be debating the agency or not of Africans, right? Like, that they have agency. Of course, everybody has agency. And because Black thinkers begin with that space, they don't have to, they don't relitigate the question of agency in the same way that John Thornton does in that particular debate. The other thing would be to say, you know, I mean, in kind of slavery literature, and sorry, I'm talking so long now, but there's a similar debate about a denial of human agency. These were humans, right? And in fact, depended on production of the plantation. So I guess it's just a kind of say that by kind of framing ourselves as responding to dehumanization through a recuperation of Black or African humanity, we might be placing the emphasis in the wrong place, right? Because it wasn't actually it wasn't dehumanization as such, but a particular conception of Black humanity that structured the slave trade. So these are just ways of saying, are there potentially other kinds of questions we could be asking? And what would those other questions be if we didn't feel like we had to prove African presence in America, we have to prove Black agency, et cetera, you know, over and over again. I also wanted to just say one thing about the question of funding very briefly, and which is, you know, there's this piece that Mahmoud Mamdani wrote 2 years ago in the LRB about the African University. And it's very interesting because it traces the kind of colonial origins of African universities, that almost all of them are products of the late colonial period. Then, you know, the kind of nationalist response and this real politicization of knowledge in service of the nationalist cause, and thinking in particular about what it means to decolonize. I'll try to find the link and put it in the chat. But you know, and for him, and this I think echoes what Kalpana said of decolonization in the contemporary period, is the variety of languages people speak on the ground, right? And how we teach African, whether and how we teach African languages, how we make available vernacular histories, right? But if we also draw from that a kind of, you know, more metaphorical use of the languages, like the concepts and frameworks through which we kind of apprehend or understand African history. So I'll find that link and put it in the chat.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about throughout this panel is you know, this need to respond, or this need to engage in a different kind of agenda setting or a different kind of question asking even. But since we have 3 minutes left, I would like to hand over to Marie to round up and summarize our discussion, if you will.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Adam, for that second very insightful comment.
Well, yeah, let me also start by thanking everyone again for their contributions. And I'm not even gonna now spend so much time summarizing, because I do think that the conversation developed quite naturally in a way that already summarized or analyzed some of the common points of interest or touching points of the individual papers and case studies in a quite concise way, right? And I really like how productive also the discussion went in terms of referencing other scholars. And Larissa and I will definitely meet again and regroup and think about how we can productively or how we can continue this extremely fertile discussion that just started here, I would say, in a way. But maybe just to highlight, well, there's 3 things, and this may of course be a bit selective, but I think not surprisingly 3 main themes maybe that I found striking, or that I would use to structure also further engagement with all of these thoughts is, well, one is the question of methodology in general, that is concepts, that is scientific methodology, and how, and I found interesting that we didn't talk so much, it was maybe mostly Monsef and maybe a bit Kasper in his paper, when we talk about more those kind of historical sciences that have more of an empirical natural science quality, archaeology, and then Ton brought up in the chat the genealogical research, any kind of prehistory, and I have looked into that a little bit, of course, as well, studying Ethiopia, and I can tell you just a little bit that is, of course, a field that definitely needs to be re-evaluated, like the kind, who tries to write the history of the origins of humanity. And that is an extremely political field, but it also has a lot to do with academic cultures, with academic masculinity cultures. Don't get me started. So this certainly needs to be revisited. But also the recording techniques. I find there's so much research on how the technology of radio has also influenced how we archive audio and visual material, and how that is, we can take a lot from maybe science and technology studies here as well, and really finding a fruitful approach that technologies are not ever neutral, but very much related and reciprocal with the context in which they're produced, the social context in which they're produced or used for production. So that's methods, and in that section of methods, more maybe theoretical and conceptual methods, and then the more empirical and technological methods. And the other big strand that I found really interesting, and of course this brought me to this panel, that I'm hoping to learn so much more about, is the question of, the history of doing history, or the history of making history, the history of historiography, to show that there is a much more varied and differentiated and complicated situation to unpack that goes way beyond, decolonizing, or saying there was a politics of history, or saying history was politicized. There's much more. And I thought maybe for me, I just scribbled down as a takeaway from the extremely insightful debate that you guys just had was, maybe one of the main takeaways is that we need to allow African history more, or not we, everyone, African history needs to be allowed to be more ambiguous and more heterogeneous. There's not a single decolonizing agency. There's not a single high court of saying this is what proper decolonization looks like, or there's not a single bar you can pass and then you get a stamp as definitely a decolonized scholar. Also thinking back to, well, debates of more current debates about, well, diversity and racism and how we view Black as a category in our contemporary conceptual view of the world, how different people, how it has a lot to do with the positionality. So I think that what we saw today in different papers, that there's many more different ways in which the history of historiography can and must be unpacked, and that the question should maybe not be so much about how can we fulfill the task of decolonizing, but more what Adam said, how can we shift emphasis? And I want to add, how can we allow to be, what I just said there, to be more ambiguity in this discussion? That is maybe how I would try to summarize. And I'm looking forward to see how this develops. Right, and I'm grateful. I'm also grateful. Let me say, Ton, since you're here personally, what a very suitable framework I found the whole conference and the theme and the outlook of the conference, the vantage point of the Africa Knows conference. I found this a very suitable framework for our panel and what we had in mind with it. So thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just so everyone knows, we'll produce a report on this at some point, and we will share it with everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, and now I'm happy to announce that for everyone who's part of the conference, a movie screening. You were able to join a movie screening that is at 8 p.m. Central European times. And the film is about Congolese high school students who are about to sit the exam for their national diploma. So I do see some connecting points to how we discussed the role of institutions and knowledge productions today as well. So I have hereby announced, and maybe if for further information, the conference website will direct you where to find the link to join the viewing.